there's something holding on.
Hey guys, and welcome to another video. My name is Damien Cooper, and today we're talking about the Canon 1DX Mark III. The good, the bad, and why we eventually returned it. So when the 1DX Mark III was first announced, I was looking at it with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I really liked the 1DX Mark II, so I was excited about the 1DX Mark III because the 1DX Mark II was our dream camera back in the day. But on the other hand, I already saw a couple red flags that might actually end up being deal breakers for us. But more on that after the intro.
We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before.
1, 2, 3, listen.
So, for everyone new to the channel, we're primarily filmmakers. We do make money with photography on the side, but the majority of our income comes from producing videos for clients and more on YouTube. So yes, we do photography, we love photography, but we can't really justify spending so much money on a stills camera because our EOS R that we're currently using is plenty enough for the jobs that we do. Even though we're getting more and more sports photography gigs, it's still not enough to justify a $6,500 camera for it. So I will talk about the photography side a little bit, but most of this video will actually be about filmmaking. And since this might be a little bit more complex, I suggest you relax, sit back, maybe get yourself a drink, and if you aren't already, subscribe to the channel. So like I already mentioned, we're not doing too much photography, but we did use the camera for photography, so let's get my opinion out of the way first, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the filmmaking side. So the very first thing that came completely apparent when using the 1DX Mark III for the first time was that I became really used to mirrorless cameras over time, and using the optical viewfinder of the 1DX Mark III seemed pretty outdated to me. Yes, you do have face detection as well as eye autofocus when not using the mirror and only using the back screen, but it still didn't feel as snappy and intuitive as it does on our EOS R. And since we only used this camera for a tiny bit and still focused on the filmmaking side, this I can't really say for certain, but I really feel like the autofocus when using the back screen was way worse than on our EOS R. We are mostly shooting portraits, so the face detection autofocus comes in really handy on our EOS R. Yes, you do have this new button that you can quickly change focus fields with, but for some reason my thumb always found the joystick, and while in action and taking pictures, I could never really quite find that new button, so I ended up never using it. Yes, the 20 megapixel sensor of the 1DX Mark III is awesome, and so is the image quality and the low light capabilities. The 20 frames is obviously a cool step up from the 16 frames previously on the 1DX Mark II if you're a sports photographer, but none of that actually justifies the heavy price tag or upgrading from the 1DX Mark II to the 1DX Mark III. So this is pretty much my opinion on the photography side, so let's talk video now. The first thing I want to talk about is the sheer amount of different shooting options. When first starting the menu and you're actually trying to choose your shooting mode, you're kind of overwhelmed by a lot of different options. So let's start our way from the top and let's make it down to the bottom. When you want to go for the highest quality possible, you have the option to shoot 5.5K RAW up to 60 frames internally. And that's a pretty big deal. And speaking of big, that's also what the file sizes are going to be when shooting RAW, because it records at a staggering 2.6 gigabits per second. Aside from the big file sizes, there's also another downside you have to deal with when you want to shoot 5.5K RAW at 50 or 60 frames per second, and that is the lack of dual pixel autofocus. As a matter of fact, there's no autofocus at all. And not only that, you also don't have access to the focus assist that you usually have when you manually focus in a mode that has autofocus. So that's a bummer too. The good thing though is that when you want to record at 5.5K RAW at 24 or 25 frames per second, you get the full sensor readout as well as dual pixel autofocus. Speaking of full frame sensor sizes, our next shooting mode is the 4K 10-bit 422. And again, you don't have any crop factors as you did with the 1DX Mark II shooting in 4K, but you do have the same cripple hammer to deal with, that when you want to shoot higher than 30 frames, you do not have autofocus at all. But at least this shooting mode records at a much lower bitrate, which is still incredibly high at 1 gigabits per second, which equals the same file sizes as you had on the C200 when recording in RAW. So if you do want to have dual pixel autofocus and shoot 4K, we have our next shooting mode, and that is the 4K crop mode. It crops in at about 1.3 times, which is the same crop you had on the 1DX Mark II. But now you're shooting in 10-bit 422 with the option of C-Log, and you have dual pixel autofocus in 25 and 24 frames, as well as 50 and 60 frames. So yes, this is still a big step up from the 1DX Mark II. You do have the same crop, but now you have 10-bit instead of 8-bit, you have a 422 color space instead of 420, and you have the option to shoot C-Log, which is pretty much a big deal. The file sizes are even bigger than on the 1DX Mark II, but again, I'll talk about this in a minute. All of the 4K shooting modes are available in All-I as well as an IPB compression. That means that the All-I has the highest quality but also the bigger file sizes, whereas the IPB is smaller in file size but is also more compressed, which means it's even harder on your computer, which is also something I will talk about in a minute. There's still no 100 or 120 frames when shooting in 4K with the 1DX Mark III, which is pretty much of a bummer. You do still have the 120 frames when shooting 1080p, but now it's 10-bit colors with C-Log and 422 colors. So that's pretty much an upgrade anyway. So as I've already briefly mentioned, let's talk about one of our deal breakers, and that are the enormous file sizes. So when shooting 5.5K RAW on the Canon 1DX Mark III, you only get about 25 minutes onto a 512GB CF Express card, which is completely bonkers. And one reason we sold our C200 was that the file sizes were just way too big for our day-to-day use. And this is actually 2.6 times bigger. So you can't really underestimate how much footage that actually is and how many terabytes of hard drives you actually need to use that kind of footage. If you only have really high production shoots and you only shoot a video every couple of months, then that's totally fine and you can shoot with the highest quality. But then again, I don't know if the 1DX Mark III is the right camera for you, and it wouldn't make more sense to rent a RED camera or a C500 Mark II or something in that range. Even when shooting in 4K at 1 gigabit per second, that is pretty much the same data rate as the C200 has when shooting RAW. So again, you have a C200 that actually shoots RAW, where opposed you only have a 10-bit 422 codec in the Canon 1DX Mark III at the same bitrate. And again, if you're a YouTuber or a content creator, or if you're working for different companies that need fast turnaround and a lot of videos, then that adds up a lot. So this codec is definitely something not to underestimate. Yes, you do have the option to shoot a higher compressed, lower quality image when choosing the IPB option. But that leads us to our next topic, and that is the computing power that you actually need to edit those files. So obviously when shooting 5.5K RAW, you're shooting RAW, and that is pretty computer intense on its own. The C200 shoots RAW light, and that has been optimized over the years for most computers these days. The 5.5K RAW on the Canon 1DX Mark III unfortunately hasn't, and we have a pretty decent computer at home, but there's no chance we can actually edit these files on our computer in Final Cut or any other editor. Even when going to about 50% of the quality, we still really can't get a decent playback. So you might think just step down to 4K 10-bit and this might actually be easy on your computer, but this couldn't be further from the truth, because every 4K shooting mode is recorded in the new H.265 codec, which is really efficient and high quality, but it's a complete bitch to edit on any computer these days. We have a $4,000 MacBook Pro and we couldn't play back any of the 10-bit files on our computer. Even when reducing our playback quality to 50% within Final Cut, we still couldn't play them back without dropping frames. Of course, it's just a laptop, so I took the files and sent them out to other content creators. And they had something from iMacs to even iMac Pros with pretty beefy specs. And the results were all the same. None of these people could actually play these files back in real time without dropping frames, let alone edit them. So that leads me to believe that there isn't really a computer out there that can handle these files these days. Yes, of course, you can just take the files and transcode them into something edit-friendly, like ProRes for example, and that's pretty much what we did. But not only will you add another step to your workflow, you'll also end up with even bigger file sizes. The way we did it is we imported the original files onto our hard drive and then transcoded them to ProRes within Final Cut Pro 10, which worked pretty great, and we could not only play them back but also edit them without a problem. But now we had the original files as well as the even bigger ProRes files, which made a 300GB project a 700GB project. So on the long run, that's really not an option. Especially if you're a content creator like us and you shoot a lot of fast turnaround projects, not only for your own YouTube channel, but maybe even for clients, then the extra step and the sheer amount of hard drive space is really something that is hard to handle. And that is just the hard drive space on your computer, and we're not even talking about the massively expensive CF Express cards that you need to record internally onto the 1DX Mark III. So all of this pretty much means that when shooting with the 1DX Mark III, you should really invest into an external recorder like the Atomos Ninja 5, because now you can directly transcode into ProRes and you don't need to have two separate files. Plus, it's way cheaper to actually record into an SSD instead of the CF Express card. Speaking of external recorders, I didn't really talk about the body of the 1DX Mark II too much, because not a lot has changed. If you've seen the 1DX Mark II, you've pretty much seen the 1DX Mark III. A couple of small things have changed though. For example, like I've already mentioned, you are now recording to CF Express cards instead of CFast 2.0 cards. The next thing that has changed is the little touch button that I've already mentioned but never used before, but the biggest difference from the 1DX Mark II is probably the full touchscreen on the back now. And that is pretty cool to have, because now you can quickly and easily access all the features in your menu. But the downside of it, it's still not an articulating screen. So when shooting primarily video on the 1DX Mark III, an external monitor, or like I mentioned, an external recorder, is definitely a must. It's really hard to judge exposure or even let alone judge focus with the small back screen that you can't really see anyway when shooting in low angle. But that again adds even more to the price tag, as well as the weight and bulk of the camera. So the next thing on our list is image quality, and that's probably the topic that most of you are most interested in. But before we talk about image quality, let's hear it from our sponsor. And what products are better to feature on your YouTube channel than your own? So let's talk about our Monkey Pixels online store, where you can find high quality, lawyer-proof production contracts as well as model release forms. With our contract bundle, you can define everything from prepayment to deliverables, as well as the rights that your client have, to completely eliminate all of misunderstandings when it comes to what the client can do, how much they owe you, and when they're due to pay. And having these contracts actually saved us many times in the past, and I can totally recommend them if you're running a business to check them out. And by the way, all the footage and all the pictures you see in this video are also graded with our custom Canon LUTs as well as our presets. So might as well check them out as well. But now let's talk about the image quality. Although I might have had a lot of bad things to say about this camera up until this point, when it comes to the image quality, I was completely blown away. The 5.5K RAW looks absolutely gorgeous. It's sharp, it's crispy, it has the typical Canon colors, which I like, and it also features a decent amount of dynamic range. When searching online, I couldn't really find any definite numbers. The only number I could find was 12 stops of dynamic range, but I'm pretty sure this only counts for the 10-bit 4K internally, and when shooting RAW, because this is where you also get access to C-Log 2, it feels more like 13 to 13.5 stops, which is comparable to the C200 when shooting in RAW. And I think this is more accurate, but after all, it's just an educated guess. When shooting 5.5K RAW on the camera, we were actually using it in midday, and we had a lot of high contrast situations, and I was pretty amazed about how the camera actually handled the dynamic range, so no complaints there. But now let's talk about the 4K 10-bit 422 codec, because this is the one that gets us the most excited, because this would be the codec that we would use the most. And this is what we also shot most of our footage in when using the 1DX Mark III. And again, the 4K footage looked completely amazing. It was crispy sharp, unlike most of the Canon footage that we were used to, because it's usually a little soft. But I don't know how to explain it, but this was definitely sharper, but still kind of maintained the cinematic softness that you're used from Canon. But the one thing I probably liked the most about the 4K 10-bit footage was its gradability, because I could really push it in every which way before it would even get close to breaking. And that is something I really appreciate. So with the footage, you could either go really natural, or you can do some really heavy grades when you wanted to. And you wouldn't have problems either way, because the Canon colors are pretty natural and easy to grade in general. But again, having the 4K 10-bit at such a high bitrate actually was easily to grade, even when going heavier, changing sky colors, or due to the footage whatever you want really. So speaking of pushing the grades, the one thing that was probably the most exciting was the camera's low light capabilities, because even when shooting in low light and high ISO, we could really push the grade, and we could raise the highlights, we could do some heavier color grading, and we virtually had no noise at all. And coming from the EOS R, which introduces a lot of noise into the shadows, especially when shooting C-Log, the 1DX Mark III had none of this. Especially since we only had the 24-70 2.8 to shoot with, so that didn't really give us the option to open our aperture a lot, so we had to raise the ISO when shooting our night shots. And again, the quality was amazing. But that also leads me to my next deal breaker, and that is the lens mount. This was probably the one thing that was the biggest deal breaker when the camera was first announced, because we just switched to the Canon EOS R and we invested a pretty penny into RF lenses, and we've definitely come to love them. We have the 28-70 2.0 as well as the 15-35 2.8, and these definitely won't be the only RF lenses we have, but since the 1DX Mark III doesn't feature an RF mount, we would have to use EF lenses. And that is kind of a bummer when it comes to future-proofing an investment like that. Because Canon was pretty vocal about not really caring about the EF lineup anymore and investing a lot of their resources into the RF lineup, which is kind of a bummer when making such a big investment into the future. So let's give you my verdict on the camera. And the biggest question when it comes to the 1DX Mark III is, who is this camera actually for? Obviously, this camera is marketed at sports photographers with the 20 frames per second, but then again, it holds a lot of features that your typical sports photographer just doesn't need, like shooting RAW or even 4K 10-bit. Especially with codecs, you can't really turn around fast, because this is something a sports photographer on a big event would usually need. So just looking at the codecs, a 5.5K RAW with just manual focus actually screams production camera. But the 1DX misses a lot of the things that a production camera would need, like internal ND filters or an external monitor or better codecs, for example. So it's not really a production camera, especially for the price, because if you have the 1DX Mark III and you're willing to spend so much money, you might as well get a cinema camera instead. So that kind of leaves us with the content creators like myself, somebody who uploads a lot of content on YouTube or shoots for other brands with fast turnaround projects, travels a lot, so they don't really want to lug around a big dedicated video camera as well as a stills camera, or shoots some occasional high-paying projects on the side where you can actually utilize the higher quality of the camera. but then again, that also has a lot of downsides. If I were to use this camera as my one and only go-to camera when traveling, the file sizes are just so enormous that I really wouldn't know where to store them while traveling, because let's be honest, for storing that much footage you actually need a RAID at home, and you don't really have a go-to travel solution for this. The next thing is when I'm traveling and I only have my laptop to work on, or when having a lot of projects that have a fast turnaround, I don't really have the time to transcode all these files into ProRes to actually be able to edit them. So all of this actually kind of feels it's pretty counterproductive when it comes to the all-arounder that only has one camera, who's traveling with it, produces a lot of content, and uploads to social media a lot. So that kind of leaves us with somebody who only does preset production jobs. But is the 1DX Mark III a dedicated photo camera really the best option for you then? Especially with so many other options from Canon out there like the C300 Mark III, the C200 or the C500 Mark II. So another option I could see this camera being used for is as a B camera to a cinema camera. But at a whooping $6,500, it's actually more expensive than the Canon C200 right now, and having a B camera just to shoot 4K interviews, for example, the EOS R with an external recorder does a really great job when using it as B cam for a C200 or C500, for example. So having a $6,500 camera as a B cam also really doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe if you want to use it for shooting on a gimbal, just get a couple of shots in, then yes, it's probably a good B cam to have. But the price tag is kinda a letdown. But let's be honest, there really isn't any other choice right now. If you want to have a hybrid camera that does it all with great autofocus, full frame shooting, having the option to shoot RAW or just 4K 10-bit at 60 frames a second, then the 1DX Mark II is currently the only option for you. And we might have actually kept it if it wasn't for the EOS R5 announcement, because that actually looks like the perfect camera for us, because it's smaller, it has almost the same specs as the Canon 1DX Mark III, sometimes even better than the 1DX Mark III. So before this camera is actually being released, I don't think you should buy the 1DX Mark III just yet, because the Canon EOS R5 might just be a tad better for you at a lower price point. But we will see about that. So how about you? Do you have a 1DX Mark III? And if so, what is your primary use case for it? And if you were to have a 1DX Mark III, what would you use it for? Because I'm really curious, because yes, right now it might be the only camera that combines all this stuff, but it also has a lot of downsides that for us at least are too big to actually make the purchase of such an expensive camera right now. So this video was a little bit longer than usual. I still hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I would like for you to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and I hope to see you on the next one.